morning, everyone. We're just waiting a little bit of time for everyone to connect, and then we'll kick things off. All right. Good morning and good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to our 2020 Key Trends and Data for the Americas and the Caribbean webinar. This is, you might have already joined us our past couple webinars held over the last 2 weeks on the road to our Global Wind Report 2021. So we're doing weekly data releases for different regions and holding these webinars to deep dive into that data, which will all culminate in the Global Wind Report 2021 published on the 25th of March. So we've already done global offshore wind, Africa and the Middle East, and next up today is Americas and the Caribbean. Before we get things started, just going over the program for today. So we'll have a short presentation from the chair of GWEC's Latin America Task Force, Ramon Fiestas, who will go over the 2020 data in both North and Latin America. Then we're going to have an expert discussion on these key trends moderated by GWEC COO Stuart Mullen and joined by Dana Younger, who is a senior advisor at GWEC, John Hensley, who is the VP of Research and Analytics at the America Clean Power Association. Ramon will also be joining us for that discussion, and Feng Zhao, who is the head of Market Intelligence and Strategy at GWEC and one of the lead report authors for the Global Wind Report. We will then go and have some time at the end of the webinar for an interactive Q&A. Interactive Q&A means essentially we will ask you, the attendees, to join us on stage and ask your questions directly to our lovely panel of experts here. So if you have any questions throughout the webinar, please submit them here on your Zoom toolbar. You can submit your questions at any time. If your question is selected, I will reach out to you and let you know that it has been selected. And then when we get to the Q&A session, you can turn on your audio here and video here, just like you would for any Zoom meeting. And if you have any troubles or you can't turn on your video and audio, please do let me know, and then we can select another question or just ask your question audibly. With that being said, I'm going to hand things off to Ramon, who will go through the 2020 data for Americas and the Caribbean. Over to you, Ramon.
Well, thank you very much, Elisa, for your introductions, and very welcome again to all of you to our regional American webcast. So there's no doubt we are celebrating an exceptional year of growth for the wind energy community. As well in the Americas, our industry managed to drive it under an unprecedented and worldwide major challenge, and thus makes this record year for wind power even more remarkable, as it is one of the key driving forces which helped cushion the economic collapse in 2020, fueling the regional economy with over $20 billion, and is contributing to the economic recovery in a number of countries in the continent. But before starting our discussions, let me briefly disclose for you some relevant figures to highlight the resilience of the wind energy sector in such an extremely complicated year for project developments. Alicia, can you put the first slide, please? We can see in the slide to what extent 2020 was our record year in wind power installed capacity, not only in North America, but also in the Latin America and Caribbean region, installing nearly 22 gigawatts of new capacity in the region, which means 62% more capacity in 2020 compared to the previous year, despite impacts of COVID-19. With close to 17 gigawatts of new installed capacity, the United States hit the highest records in the history, which means close to double of the figures in 2019. It's remarkable that only in the fourth quarter, the supply chain has shown its real full potential, putting into operation over 9 gigawatts, which means the same amount as the total installed in 2019. 2020 was a record year for wind power as well in Latin America, with close to 5 gigawatts of installed capacity in the year. Where it is to mention the recovery of the market in Brazil, hitting as well his annual record with more than 2.3 gigawatts by the time Mexico has entered into stagnation, shifting from second to fourth position this year. Can we go to the second slide? In the LAC region, we can clearly identify 5 markets in which the industry is largely established, reaching 34 gigawatts with growth of 16-fold over the past decade, with Brazil as the outstanding leader representing over 50% of the total regional installed capacity. The region has closely reached the milestone of 36 gigawatts we predicted in 2010 for the accelerate scenario in our forecast for the decade. Wind energy is the fastest growing power source in the region, accounting more than 23% of all new power capacity in Latin America and the Caribbean over the past decade, and has raised Uruguay into second largest wind energy power matrix, sharing the world as the largest power source with over 35% of the total generation supplied in the year. Nevertheless, new markets are as well arising in Latin America, as is the case in Colombia, which will help to fuel the pipeline of projects in the region in the current decade. But shadows are as well clouding our forecast as a number of major challenges are arising again in the horizon in certain markets to keep the path of the energy transition, as it is particularly the case in Mexico and to a different extent as well in Argentina. If we go to the third slide, Alisa. The United States drove the record growth in North America, installing nearly 17 gigawatts of new capacity in 2020. That has tripled in size since 2010 and nearly quadrupled its share in the electricity matrix. Wind energy is powering 34 million American homes with clean and reliable energy and has proven as an essential source to keep the lights on in the Americas and balance the outages of other energy sources. Total wind power capacity in the Americas is reaching near to 170 gigawatts, appearing as an outstanding continental leader in the United States with over 70% of the market share, followed by Brazil and Canada with over 10% each of both countries, showing steady growth in the current decade despite the discrete results this year in Canada. The continent is closing the gap with Europe's total installed capacity figures, as the Americas had installed in 2020 more than 150% the annual installed in the European Union, and is helping to avoid 250 million tons of CO2 emissions annually, which is equivalent to taking 1.2 billion passenger cars off the road. So, and now I will pass it again to Alicia to start our discussions with Stuart. Alicia.
Muchas gracias, Roman. Thank you for that. Really exciting to see such record years in both North and Latin America in 2020, despite COVID-19 and everything else going on in the region. So really shows the resilience of the wind power industry. And to dive a bit deeper into that and some of the key trends in the region, I will now hand it off to Stuart for our expert discussion. Over to you.
Thank you very much, Alyssa. And again, to those listening at the webinar, can you please remember to ask your questions? I think it's a fascinating market and a fascinating region, and I'm sure that there's many questions. We will use the next 10 to 15 minutes to ask the panelists some questions about exciting markets, reflect a little bit on the US about what's happened. We will have a look at what's the challenges in Mexico, and then dive a little bit into what are the lessons learned from what did we learn from Texas recently before opening up to the panel to questions from the floor. So I'd like to start off with you, Ramon. So thank you very much for taking us through those. It seems that Latin America is, on the runway for taking off and everything's looking, rosy out in the market. But is that the case? I mean, what are the real markets? What markets excite you most? And I mean, are there any markets? I guess we could look at Mexico. Are there any markets where you think that there might be some challenges over the next 12 months?
Yeah. Thank you, Stuart. Definitely. I would say when we look into Latin America, we need to realize somehow different development trends in the past and different situation in each country that makes the wind power growth not regular in each of the countries. So I think that one of the happiest notice for this year is that the Brazilian market has recovered his historical trend, and more than that, because as I told, Brazil has hit his record year again. And this is remarkable because despite the internal situation in Brazil with COVID, with the political changes, the market has found a way of growing in parallel to what is the regulated ambient of traditional electricity auctioning in the country. So as probably everybody knows, one of the main drivers of wind power growth in Latin America is currently the auctions that are settled down by the governments in order to force the distribution companies to buy the share of green power they settle in the national targets for green. But in the case of Brazil, we have been following a trend that starting probably 4 or 5 years ago, in which because of the high competitiveness of the technology in the country, the market is, the large consumer market is asking for green, reliable, and cheap energy, and this is wind power. And there is a trend that is opening a market-based current or a market-based trend to contract in the long term renewable power through wind power in a private scheme of purchasing. So this is probably one of the happiest news in the region, because this is something that probably is going to somehow be replicated in other jurisdictions in order to see, let's say, a sustainable growth in the development of projects over all the region. So the good news is that Brazil has recovered the path with the new formula. This is private purchasing out of the regulated scheme. On the other hand, we see Chile recovering as well, a very, very interesting trend of market development, in which probably this year Chile was the country in the continent that has been more hit by the collateral effects on the industry by the COVID-19 pandemic, especially in regard the distance measures taken by the government in order to prevent contagions and so on. This means that we have been forecasting much higher amounts of wind power developments for this year in Chile, and if we didn't see them in operation, it's just because the construction timeline has been somehow distorted by these confinement measures in the supply chain in Chile. But despite that, aside that, the market in Chile is a very healthy market, and is probably providing us with a sustainable pipeline of 400, 500, maybe more megawatts on a yearly basis in the next decade. And then we need to look into the new incomer. This is Colombia. Colombia is on the path of establishing the rules and the framework in order to achieve a sustainable market growth path for renewable energies that started 2 years ago with a number of regulatory measures, including some auctions done in different schemes that have been that put on in the supply chain almost 2.5 gigawatts of wind power to be developed in the next 2-3 years. Of course, there are some logistical constraints there that are related to the unmatured market and the infancy of the developments in this country, because they have faced renewable energies recently, 2-3 years ago, and this means the market, the industry, and the supply chain needs to fit together in order to see these projects working and under operation. Of course, as well, a number of issues regarding the licensing process of the projects, and including the licensing process of the transmission grid system that is supposed to connect the major part of the largest part of the wind power in the region of La Guajira, has as well is driven some resistance in order to see the projects in time operating. But we are confident on the capability of the government of Colombia in order to help and to help driving this procedure obstacles ahead, and we are pretty sure to see the market growing in the next year in Colombia as well. I would say this is the big picture. We can talk about Argentina, we can talk, of course, we will talk about Mexico, but I would leave it for later on, Stuart.
Yeah, thank you very much, Ramon. That was a very comprehensive answer, so thank you for walking us through that. Actually, Feng, I'd like to bring you in here to talk about, Ramon mentioned sort of like stability in the region. Is the stability that we see in these regions and the ambition that we see, is this enough to keep the supply chain attractive, and for developers attractive? Is this, have we got enough volume in the market and enough I guess calm in the market to be able to roll out and to attract the big developers and OEMs?
Yes, thank you for the question, Stuart. I think in general, if we're looking at the region, so from the turbine OEM perspective in Latin America, actually, as you know, it has been really crowded over the years, specifically in Brazil, due to the auction scheme, in order to qualify the local low interest rate turbine OEM has to be certified by close follow the strict local content requirement. The process has been going on for more than a decade. And if we take a look where we are today, simply the tier 2 or tier 3 supplier has disappeared. So you can see, I think, looking at Latin America in general, it's left by 4 big European turbine OEM, Vestas, SGRE, GE, Nordics, plus a couple of Chinese suppliers. We did the supply chain assessment last year, for example, just looking at the blades alone, a big challenge in this market. It's not because the market it's too big. No, actually, it's missing this kind of instability, or realistically speaking, even though looking at the auction in the pipeline, there are some kind of uncertainty in terms of availability. Therefore, a big competition, and the turbine OEM have to find a solution to working with the tier 1 component supplier. We see, for example, in Brazil, Wrapup wind power, that's part of Enercon. They have closed out the 2 factories, and so this one of the facility actually to a local blade supplier called Ares Energy for blades. So you can see how intensive it is. Right now, looking at the capacity, I think the output in terms of annual production from turbine OEM side is more than what's the demand from the region. Therefore, I think I don't see any kind of challenge. And looking at the growth curve for the next 5 years, specifically for Latin America, I think it shouldn't be any challenge for turbine oil to meet the demand. Actually, it's a challenge for turbine oil to lock the deal. So therefore, competition will remain really high. And I think that's also a challenge for turbine to maintain a certain margin in this region. For the US, I think I'm going to leave that to John. He knows this better than I do. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you very much for that, Peng. So, John, if we lift our eyes a little bit geographically speaking and turn our gaze to the US, it was an interesting year, a big year for the US, maybe not as big as what we had expected, maybe it was bigger than what we expected. Can you fill us in a little bit about what the sentiment's like in the US at the moment and what was the impact of COVID and versus the extension of or the retiring of the PTC, and also maybe we can look at a little bit if there's been any offshore impact since the Biden administration changed.
Yeah, so thanks. Happy to jump in on a number of those questions. As everyone's mentioned, certainly a big year in the U.S. Last year we did close to 17 gigawatts of new installs, which is a record by a fair bit in the country. And, you know, thinking about expectations going into 2020, 17 gigawatts was kind of right smack in the middle of where consultants and other folks monitoring the industry sort of expected things to be. I do think there were a number of projects that were originally targeting a 2020 COD that eventually slipped into 2021. And a lot of that stems from some of the COVID-19 disruptions that we saw and frankly are still continuing to see in the marketplace. You know, in fact, it's sort of incredible to think about the market being able to actually pull together and deliver 17 gigawatts in such a disruptive environment. And, you know, the federal government did a few things to help. They extended the deadline, the safe harbor deadline for the production tax credit so that, you know, projects that were originally trying to get online by 2020 and qualify for the full value of the PTC had an additional year in order to accomplish that. So that provided flexibility, which meant, you know, we could shift things around in the supply chain to ensure that those projects could move forward and wouldn't sort of kind of be dead on arrival because they couldn't source parts, components, or servicing in time to get them online. So, you know, I think there are still some continuing challenges from COVID-19 and projects that could be pushed but now some of those projects are starting to, you know, continue to experience challenges and may need some additional time to get across the finish line here. As you know, supply chains are still tight, sourcing of certain materials continues to be difficult, and restrictions are still in place in a lot of places. So, you know, challenges continue. However, I think as we kind of flip to the political side, there's a lot of optimism and momentum building for clean energy industries kind of writ large as the Biden administration has moved in and put together this Build Back Better plan, which calls for a zero emissions grid by 2035, which is certainly, you know, driving a lot of conversations around how do we achieve that? What scale of deployment do we need to see across wind, solar, energy storage, et cetera, to meet that ambitious goal? And then, you know, a lot of conversations around what additional federal policy mechanisms can be put in place. There are a couple of bills that have either been introduced already or that are, you know, close to introduction that seek to extend the tax credits further and provide some of that regulatory kind of certainty that's needed in the marketplace to continue the industry going forward. You mentioned the offshore market. It certainly, you know, a lot more attention these days is paid to the offshore market as we're starting to actually see some momentum and traction for some of these projects. And after a couple of years of kind of delays and frustrations on the regulatory side, we saw a couple of days ago, BOEM published the final EIS for Vineyard Wind, which is looking to be the first utility scale offshore project in the market. So there's a 30-day public comment period, and then hopefully have a decision here within the next month or so and kick that project off. But that market is huge. We've already got 9 gigawatts of projects that have power purchase agreements or other contracts in place. And if you start looking at forecasts out through 2030, we're starting to see numbers around 30 gigawatts by the end of the decade. Potentially more movement upwards as that market really starts to kick off. But again, there, lots of issues around supply chain, sourcing of parts, components, and materials to support that industry as well.
Yeah, thank you very much, John. And there was a lot of questions there, so I apologize for piggybacking all of those questions together. Dana, I'd like to bring you in here. I mean, you're a stalwart of the wind industry, and there's probably not much you haven't seen. Did you ever in your wildest dreams think that you would see this much volume in the US in any given year? And I mean, what's your perspective, or how does this fit into the historical perspective, and what would you expect to see as an extrapolation of that moving forward? And just remember to take yourself off mute.
Thanks, Stuart. If I could actually extend that question to the Latin America, I'll try to do that as well. First off, I have been involved with the U.S. wind industry since its birth in California in the 1980s, and I think at that time people would have been very happy to have gotten to levels of, a gigawatt of annual installations, or even 500 megawatts. The industry was quite small at that time. So we've moved very rapidly and dramatically up this cumulative installation curve. And I would just underscore what John said, that this is really unprecedented what was accomplished by the U.S. wind industry during 2020, during the disruptions associated with COVID. And I wouldn't underestimate what companies had to overcome. The OEMs on the one hand, the EPC contractors, the utilities, the regulatory authorities, to manage to keep momentum going. And I absolutely, agree with John that the looming development in the U.S. is the build out of offshore potential. And really, we've only begun to tap that initially on the East Coast. But if you look to the history of offshore developments in the oil and gas industry, it's really been the Gulf of Mexico that was, built out first. And with the development of floating offshore wind, you certainly might have the possibility for wind eventually, off the Pacific coast as well, which has extremely deep water, as you may know. In Latin America, I'm reflecting, Ramon, back to the 1990s, really, because it was in the 1990s, 25 years ago, when Costa Rica installed its first wind projects. And when I first got going in the industry, everybody talked about the 70 megawatts that was installed in Costa Rica, and that was really about it. And we've just come miles since then. And maturing markets like Brazil. I also was involved when Dilma Rousseff was the energy minister in 2003 under President Lula. I was at a high-profile renewable energy conference with her when she said, Brazil will never build any wind. It's too expensive. And we've seen what's happened. So, there have just been dramatic changes in the contours of the energy industry, the renewable energy industry, and the wind industry, over the intervening decades. And I think it is very promising, but we are going to touch on some issues that I think Ramon will begin to address that, are currently maybe holding back the next level of build out in Latin America, certainly. But I see very bright prospects continuing in the US.
Yeah, thank you very much, Dana.
Hey,
sorry, John.
Stuart, if I can just add a follow-up comment on that. I on the one hand, yes, 2020 was a record year for the U.S. industry, but as we start to think about some of these more ambitious goals around, 100% zero emissions by 2035, or even, a step back from that, we've been looking at scenarios like 50% renewable energy penetration by 2030. The level of deployment increase that we're going to need to see in order to achieve those goals is something on the order of a 2x or a 3x increase in what we saw in 2020. So yes, unprecedented, but it sort of follows this, this historical curve of continually getting bigger and being a more important part of the electricity mix. I hope that's the direction that we're going, that, we can continue to overcome some of these supply chain challenges, continue to drive costs out of the system, and look towards larger and larger deployment years.
Yeah, thank you very much for that contribution, John. So I would remind again, for people that have questions, please pose them in the chat, and Alyssa will bring you up on stage. We'll probably take this conversation for another 5 minutes before we start bringing people up on stage. So just please keep your questions coming, and Alyssa will reach out to you. So that's kind of like the historical context. What I'd like to do now is touch on some of the contemporary issues that we're seeing. So Ramon, could you take us through what's happened in Mexico recently, from the bill and to the fallout of that bill?
Yes, of course, Stuart. We are working really hard, close together with the Mexican stakeholders, and especially with the association with AMDE, in order to tackle this issue and to reverse the situation if we can. What is happening in Mexico now? I think the most precise approach to the issue is that private investments in the energy sector, and particularly in the renewable energy arena, are against the policy agenda of the president of the country in Mexico. This policy agenda for the energy sector is driving through the idea of recovering the dominant position of the state-owned electricity company, Comisión Federal de Electricidad, and to do that, so to recover the dominant position in the generation area of electricity in Mexico, it is necessary to avoid competition. It is necessary to stagnate each single renewable energy project, and it is necessary to give preference in the access to the grid to the old fossil fuel burning devices of Comisión Federal de Electricidad. So this means that we are not facing only dramatic retroactive change in the legal framework and in the secondary policies. What we are facing is a different political view on how the energy sector in Mexico should run in the future. Fortunately, this is only a view of the current administration, and we don't think that this is the large feeling of the Mexicans. This is a political question that is trying to put some advantages in the government now in power, that is facing new elections, new Congress elections in June, and will be probably, I would say, a showcase in order to see what is going to happen in the future in the electricity sector in Mexico. This is not just a matter for renewable energies. This is a matter of private investments in the electricity sector and as well in the oil sector in Mexico. So there is a political campaign ongoing, started by the current administration, in order to reinforce this absurd idea of energy sovereignty through, I would say, a bankrupt company. So and this is something very difficult to, let's say, to change in the minds of the current legislators and policymakers in Mexico. We hope that the reason behind the development of renewable energies, not only in Mexico, worldwide, is again coming and rising on the tables, and we can open an intelligent debate about renewable energies and the future of the energy sector in Mexico in the coming months.
Yeah, thank you, Ramon. So Feng, just quickly from your perspective, what do you, from your market intel perspective, are you likely to see much fallout from this in other parts of the world, or is this a purely a Mexican challenge?
I think in general, it's a little bit, look at what's going on in Mexico, as Ramon mentioned, it's a kind of political challenge. If we look at the big picture, look at no matter in Europe, APAC, or North America, or Latin America, I think probably Mexico is one kind of like a unique country where they are doing in opposite direction. The whole world, as you know, start from September the 26th, the Chinese President Xi Jinping come out with a carbon neutral target by 2060, followed up by Japan, South Korea, and also the green recovery package in Europe, which covers 2050 carbon neutral target as well. In general, I think the whole world has come to the same page about where we need to go in terms of, decarbonization, CO2 reduction to meet the Paris target. So I think looking at the, what's going on during the pandemic, I think even though a lot of constraint in terms of supply chain project execution, as John mentioned in the US, but the outcome, no matter from China or from US, has indicated that what the industry can be, can achieve, during their tough time. And it's the same in Scandinavia, for example, in Norway. Norway, in terms of onshore, it's the #1 market last year. So again, I think the trend we see in Mexico, that's quite a unique. I really hope that the campaign GWEC that's led by Ramon could really, the government, the Senate understood where we are today and what the rest of the world are doing. I think the signal is simple. We have to working country by country, cross industry to reach the goal. But again, looking at where we are for the annual report, I think it's quite positive, message we deliver. And even, looking at the oil and gas chapter, we can see very active and engagement from oil and gas sector. So again, back to the challenge in Mexico, I really hope that's a temporary one, and we really need to, get this right. Back to you, Stuart.
Yeah, thank you very much. And I can see we're starting to be joined on stage by a number of participants. So I'll quickly ask my last question to John before we hand over, and I'll come to you first, Lysias. John, the fallout from the Texas outage, is that likely to help or hinder us, like accelerate or slow down the rollout? What did the wind industry take a hit on this, or from reputation, or we just I guess was a bit of a fall guy for the whole challenge?
Yeah, it's a good question. I think, the dust is still settling a bit on this, given kind of the unprecedented nature of that event. I think, unfortunately, at the get-go of the event, there were some opponents who took the opportunity to use the crisis as rationale for trying to blame the increase of renewable, or blame the rollouts on the increase of renewable generation in the Texas market. And frankly, what we saw was, an unprecedented weather event in Texas that hit, essentially all aspects of the infrastructure down there, including wind and solar projects. But, at the end of the day, the vast majority of the impacts or the loss of power came from the thermal sector, as all components of the natural gas supply chain really started to break down as you couldn't get gas to plants, and plants started to have their own issues. And then deliverability issues in terms of transmitting the electrons across the transmission network. So, I think unfortunately in the beginning of that, there was a lot of passing the buck to wind. But as we've set the record straight, and as ERCOT and others have provided more light on exactly what did take place and what were some of the root cause issues for those rolling blackouts, I think it sparked a larger conversation of, how do we think about this increasing renewable penetration futures, and how do we think about market design and overall connectivity of the electric grid to ensure that we are prepared for this energy transition and are prepared to handle really high levels of renewable penetration and maintain system reliability at the end of the day. So I think, it's kicked off a good conversation that we need to have, but unfortunately, I think, we took some unfair flack at the beginning of it all.
Yeah, thanks for that. That's a really interesting assessment of the challenges. So we'll go to Lysias now and then to Lillian straight afterwards. So Lysias, can you just introduce yourself, please, and let us know your question, and we'll find out which of our panelists are best suited to answer.
Okay. Hello, everyone. Great panel and conversation, and much appreciate being here. I'm Lysias Abreu. I'm a sales director at Hubble Incorporated. I live in North Carolina, but I'm from Brazil, and the Latin American market in the Caribbean is near and dear to me. And I've worked on the onshore wind sector in the region before. But as we look at the U.S. offshore wind market taking off, as we heard from John, what are your perspectives on the market outlook for offshore across Latin America, and which markets or countries are likely to take the lead? Where is the offshore wind potential, governmental regulatory support, and supply chain readiness? If you can think about synergies with the U.S. and what we've learned so far, I'd appreciate that. That's my question. Thank you.
Thank you very much for that. Let's. I'm not sure if it's Ramon or John that should start. I think we'll get you both in on this, but maybe if we start with Ramon in terms of
Thank
the.
Yeah. Thank you, Stuart. Yeah. Well, first of all, we need to realize that offshore wind, when Latin America has so huge onshore sites still to deploy, offshore is not a priority in Latin America. But have said that, it is true that there is a huge opportunity for offshore wind projects in Latin America, especially in countries like the case of Brazil. Why? Because you have a supply chain for onshore there that can be as well a very good supplier for offshore in a number of elements and situations. Because it's the most major market in terms of understanding the role of wind power in the electricity sector. And because there are ongoing projects in offshore in Brazil, and Brazil is preparing somehow the background of its policy in order to deploy offshore. But we need to realize that this is not going to take, it's not going to be fast. This is going to take time, and the offshore projects are going to take time, and we won't see an offshore wind farm in operation until the next, say, 6-7 years in Latin America.
Thanks very much for that.
I could chime in, Stuart, just on the back of that, Ramon. Just for Lysias and the other people on the call, I just draw your attention to the fact that GWEC is collaborating together with the World Bank Group in a UK government-funded initiative to look at the potential of offshore wind in many emerging market countries, and in LATAM in particular, Brazil and Colombia have been identified as two very promising markets. And there will be publications out of that, so you may be interested in following that. I know I've also had discussions that I'm sure Ramon has in the past with government officials in other Latin American countries who've inquired about offshore wind. But as Ramon pointed out, it's kind of premature in most markets where you still have significant undeveloped terrestrial potential, which is significantly cheaper.
Yeah, thank you for that, Dana. And also, I should also further into that, GWEC actually does work with emerging markets as well. We have some of our people, we work with them in terms of market readiness and market preparation. So we try to actually help accelerate or find pathways to market for these new markets. John, I just wanted to hear quickly if you had anything to add, or did you cover most of the answers when you touched on offshore the first time?
Yeah, I think I probably covered most of the answers. You know, the one thing that I might add is it's a similar situation here in the U.S. where terrestrial wind opportunity and sort of potential is enormous. And what we really saw, and cheaper, frankly, but what we really saw was leadership on the state front to implement, you know, targets and goals for offshore wind development. And that's really been at the core of what's promoted offshore wind here in the U.S. And so, you know, as we think about countries like Brazil, which have large population centers along the coast, and as you start to run into more of those physical infrastructure constraints, actually getting the power from the good wind resource areas on land to market, it starts to shift the paradigm and the focus to offshore. And states and provinces can take a real leadership role in sort of recognizing that early and trying to get ahead of that trend and promote the industry sooner than we actually need it. And that's really what we've seen happen along the East Coast.
Thank you very much for that. I know that we're kind of gone over a little bit of time now, but I really would like to have the rest of the panelists or the rest of the people on stage get a chance to ask their question. So Lillian, I guess you're up next. Remember to unmute yourself, and congratulations for being the only woman on the panel. That's in the week of International Women's Day, flying the flag for women. So well done there, but I'd like to hear your question.
Thank you very much. My name is Lilian Cabral. I work as a country manager in Brazil for a Danish software company. And thank you about everything that you are telling here. All the data are so valuable for our business on the wind industry here in Brazil. My question is about the new things that we have already in the country related to the political instability. So we have already seen a large companies leaving the country, such as Suzlon and ISA. And today we have this global health crisis, and we are still facing this political and now legal instability in our country. On the other hand, we see that we have a huge growth in the wind market. We have more than 18 gigawatts of wind energy, and the auction is scheduled for the next 3 years. So my question is whether this would be something that will lead foreign companies to consider entering the Brazilian market. Thank you so much.
Thank you. Then we'll start with Ramon again here, and then I'll move over to Feng.
Yeah, I would say that the resilience of the Brazilian wind power market has shown his face this year. And when I was explaining the growth in Brazil, or the recovery of the trend, I was explaining that it is based on a new fact, that is the competitiveness of wind power in the Brazilian market and the attractive of this competitiveness for large consumers. So this makes, when you have a competitive product in your market and somebody needs to buy that, it's the political situation is very difficult that can break that logic. There is a logic behind, and this logic, if the logic keeps like it is, I would say there is no drama in political changes. So the question is in Brazil that one of the fundamentals of the competitiveness of wind power is the BNDES financing costs. Okay, so this is something that you need to take into consideration. How can this drive in one way or in another way in order to keep competitiveness in wind power?
Thanks for that, Dana. Paul, you're on mute, mate.
Thank you for question, Lilian. I think based on what Ramon said, even though it is true, Brazil so far in terms of cumulative installation is the largest market in Latin America, and the auction scheme has brought a lot of opportunity for for international company and also local supplier. But I think what's the challenge you mentioned, including the lift of the big company like Suzlon, it's not a surprise at all, because looking at what's going on globally speaking, or just in another part of the world. First, back in the 1990s or beginning of 2000, in Europe, we have so many turbine OEM, and later on, start from the late of 2000, and mainly in China, at certain point of time, 2010, you got like around 50 turbine OEMs. But again, the situation today is similar to what you just mentioned. Brazil, no doubt about, that's another very competitive location. You could call it Brazil. It's one of the key turbine production hubs, but the capacity offered to the marketplace for OEMs, or for the capacity available in that region in general, do not sustain the sustainable growth. You got the auctions, you got the political challenge, also like Raman mentioned, and also in some market, up and on in terms of policy, competition, plus the instability of the policy do not really helpful. So therefore, looking at our GWEC supply side data in 2019, now we're working on 2020 data, looking at the Latin America in that region, four company, as I mentioned earlier, those big four, Vestas, GE, Nordics Group, and SGRE, they have more than 90% of our market share. And this is not a surprise at all, and it's not strange. If you look at the global picture, and start from 2019, out of the top 10 turbine OEMs, the top 6 already have more than 70% of a global market share. That's a trend. And also looking at where we need to be, and also the cost of reduction, and follow the onshore, subsidy free already in China, and we're competitive competition. No matter where you are, even in Africa or the Middle East, the competition is really hot, and OEMs have to follow, the reality. The increase of turbine production do not generate even though it is increase the revenue generation, but do not really help with the EBITDA or the profit. Therefore, OEM at the end of the day have to think about where they are today in terms of production. They have to restructure the location and production, make sure that they can copy the very challenging market. I think it's not a surprise we're going to continue to see the market consolidation over the next 5 to 10 years. Lilian, thank you.
Thank you very much, Fang. And I hope that was a suitable answer to your question, Lilian. So LB, we'll turn to you now as our last question, but just before I let you introduce yourself, for those people that have posed questions in the chat, if we haven't had a chance to bring you on stage, then we will get back to you with answers to those questions as we go. But LB, if you'd like to lead with your question.
Yes, sure. So I hope you hear me. So LB Kramer. So I've probably the only one based in Europe, because the wind is blowing all around the earth. And I have started around 20 years ago onshore wind in Europe, and 15 years ago offshore. And that's why now I'm also with the Capel global group of yards, with a few yards in the US and Brazil, acting in the offshore. And that's where I'm coming with two short questions. One of them, I think I've already been slightly answered. I think the offshore wind start to be globally very competitive with regard to the place, the acceptance problem that we don't have as onshore. The grid, especially if we see Brazil or in Europe, you can go not too far offshore, and you are directly near to the big off-taker. But what I see, the two main issues, one in Brazil, for example, the competition now with onshore and the other market, not the political aspect, but more the business aspect. So I think with the COVID now and the industry slowing down, how do you see the impact in the next year? So I think that the offshore wind was starting to be really seriously considered in Brazil, especially floating. But I'm afraid that we may now lose more or less 4 or 5 years because there is not the demand now, and I'm not sure when the demand for the electricity will come again. That's the first question. The second one, quickly more to the north part of America. We see now the offshore wind really starting very, very strongly. But I see two aspects again regarding possible, not stop, but something pushing a little bit back at the cost. In America, the developer are able to put quite a nice amount of money to reserve the lease, which was not the case in Europe. And even if offshore is really competitive, I'm afraid that this cost will have to be covered somehow. And the second cost which have to be covered is regarding the increased cost for fabrication and installation, especially Jones Act. So I'm quite happy on one side because we are now building the first Jones Act vessel, installation vessel in one of our yard, but on the other side, I'm not sure exactly how for the midterm it will have to be covered in the business model or maybe transferred to the off-taker.
Thank you very much, LB, for that question, and thank you for putting some context to your questions as well. Maybe if we start with John here, and if there's anything again to talk about in terms of the US leasing and the cost of the US lease areas and what that impact will have on the cost of offshore. And then maybe we'll take Dana as well quickly.
Yeah, Stuart, happy to start on this, and thanks for the question. You know, I think as this industry starts to take off, you know, obviously we're gonna do a lot of learning by doing, and costs are gonna come down as we do get Jones Act compliant vessels in place, as the supply chain continues to establish itself in the US, and we kind of build that workforce of US-based workers that can build these projects and operate and maintain them. So, you know, we're heading in the right trajectory, and I think you're seeing that in terms of the power purchase agreement strike prices that have been announced over the last couple of years with, you know, I think Mayflower kind of coming in at the low point somewhere around, if I recall correctly, $58 a megawatt hour. Now, you know, a real concern when you start looking at wholesale power prices in the region, and they're generally on the order of $30 a megawatt hour, or in that neighborhood. So, you know, how do you make up the difference? And again, here is where the states have taken a real leadership role in terms of mandating these offshore wind projects and providing an OREC program, an offshore renewable energy credit program to help on the financing end. I think we've also, you know, we saw a big move at the end of last year with the establishment of a 30% offshore wind tax credit alongside a 10-year safe harbor for those projects. So that provides certainly a very long runway from a tax credit standpoint in terms of you know, continuing to incentivize these projects and help on the cost front. But you know, over time, those costs will continue to come down. We will become more efficient in developing and owning and operating these projects. So you pair that alongside the state leadership, and that gets you a long way. You know, the other point that I think is important here is that, yes, there are really good wind resources along kind of the mid-Atlantic and New England regions in the US, but, you know, increasingly siting and permitting have become major constraints, not just for wind, but, you know, for other renewable energy technologies as well, as you think about trying to build these close to population centers. And so, you know, as you mentioned, kind of offshore provides that alternative, and those states have made that decision. That's the route they want to go.
Thank you very much. And look, I think that, mindful of the time now, we're at the top of the hour. So LB, I think that we'll have to take your slowdown question at another time, or maybe someone from the team can get back to you in relation to that. But firstly, I would like to thank both Lucilus and Lillian and LB for participating in this panel, and to the panelists, John, thank you very much. Dana, thank you very much. Ramon and Fung. Alyssa, I'm not sure if you'd just like to just wrap it up with the last, or the road to the Global Wind Report. And thank you very much for joining.
Thanks, Stuart. Yeah, so thanks. That was a super interesting discussion, everyone. And as Stuart mentioned, if we didn't get a chance to answer your question, you can send us an email. Oh, let me just put my email address on the screen there. So that's my email. So feel free to reach out and we can answer your questions offline. And then I just wanted to mention that next week we will be doing our Asia Pacific data release and be holding a webinar on the 18th of March at 10 a.m. Central European time. So be sure to register for that webinar. If you scan that QR code right there, you'll have the links to not only that webinar registration, but also the webinar for our Global Wind Report 2021 launch. So please feel free to join us in those next 2 stops on the road to the Global Wind Report 2021. And big thank you again to all of our GWEC experts, and a special thank you to John joining us from the American Clean Power Association. We really appreciate you joining us today and sharing our insights on the US market. So thanks everyone, and I hope you have a great rest of your evening or morning, afternoon, wherever you may be. We'll see you again next week for the Asia Pacific webinar. Bye everyone.
Bye-bye.